Hello and welcome as we come now to the third week of regular time, as we call it, of this, what we call the A year. And the readings this time, the first reading comes from, again, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 8, verses 23 through chapter 9, verses 3. So it crosses the line on that one. From Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 10 through 13, and then verse 17. And finally, the gospel comes from Matthew, who is our guide this year, chapter 4, verses 12 through 23. Now, one of the consistencies of the synoptic writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is that Jesus did not begin his public ministry until John the Baptist was off the scene. And so as we hear in the gospel, Jesus does not begin his ministry until John is in prison. Now, if you think about it, John had been quite successful and effective in his ministry in his own right. Certainly his teaching and his approach would not be the same as that which is attributed to Jesus, but nevertheless, he was successful in what he was doing in his baptisms and in his teachings, and perhaps had grown a community around himself. We don't know a lot about that, but there is good support to suggest that Jesus himself had become a disciple of John, that what John was teaching, looking forward to a coming Messiah, to a new time, to a new age, would have been something that Jesus himself would have been listening to and learning. Again, there's not a lot that we know about what went on between the time of Jesus' baptism by the Baptist and the episode that we hear this time. So if Jesus had become a disciple of John, he now ventures out, once John is in prison, Jesus ventures out on his own and gathers his own disciples, but continued to baptize and broaden his ministry. Now, so here's the kind of question that those who kind of look at this a little bit, and we can only speculate, and for our purposes of our study here, perhaps it is interesting just to consider some of these things, that Jesus now will broaden his own ministry. If he had started kind of following certain practices and teachings of John, he now has his own insights and his own understanding of what his ministry should be like. Jesus recognizes that he had special gifts. Think in mind that John is pictured as teaching, but Jesus now, in these opening chapters of Matthew's Gospel, chapters 3 and 4 and 5, picture Jesus as being a healer. This was not something that the Baptist is associated with. So in other words, and Mark was perhaps the first to notice this, but Matthew and Luke picked this up in their presentations, has the special gift of being able to heal. And we hear a number of stories of Jesus healing different afflictions that people have. Also, Jesus is able to cast out demons. We hear stories about this. And thus, it becomes clear that Jesus has a distinctive ministry of his own, which is different from that which the Baptist had. All right? So we give that a little bit to see that there was a connection between the Baptist, John, and Jesus, and that now once, as we noticed, John is off the scene, Jesus now begins his ministry. He also moves goes up to the Galilee. Now, once again, we know that from other sources that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, which was a small village or hamlet in the Galilee, and that he perhaps had come down, as we mentioned on other occasions, had come down to where John was for his baptism, and therefore had stayed there. But now he returns to the Galilee, but he decides to move from Nazareth to Capernaum or Capernaum, depending on how your accent works with that one, and uses that as a center for his ministry. Now, what we know about Capernaum was that originally it was known as the village of Nepron, and it is in the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Again, the Sea of Galilee we have mentioned on a number of times, had different names. The Sea of Galilee, by the way, I think we've mentioned this, but just to kind of review a moment here, is shaped like a harp. And when you look on a map or you see a picture of Galilee, it's large like this and then comes down like a harp. It is 8 miles at its widest point across, and is 32 miles around. Now, as we mentioned, it was known by different names as the Sea of Gennesareth, the Sea of Tiberias, named after the emperor at a certain point when Herod, Herod Antipas had decided to build a city or town named Tiberias on the sea. We thought, some thought anyway, that the reason he built that was to draw attention to Palestine, that maybe he could get people to come there, spend a little money, and kind of put it more on the map for the Roman world. It was also known as the Lake of Gennesareth. So it went by different titles, depending sometimes on who the gospel writer was or who the interpreter of this particular body of water was. Capernaum was, so going back to the city itself, was known as the Via Mare, namely that it was located at a trading route. Those who came from the east would come through Capernaum and then head down south on the road to Egypt, where much of the trading took place. So this was, from the viewpoint of if you were going to make a center of something, a good place to go, okay? Jesus is pictured as being at home there. In other sections of the gospel, we're not quite sure when it says that Jesus was at home there, whether he was staying at someone else's place or whether or not actually he might have had a place of his own. We don't know for sure what the word at home means. You can interpret that as you would like, I suppose, all right? Now, Galilee was, at the time that we're speaking here, under the aegis, politically, of Herod Antipas. His territory was the Galilee, and then Perea, which was a section of land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. The reason for this change in understanding had been, you remember that when Herod the Great had died, his kingdom had been divided among his 3 sons, and that the Judean territory had been given to one of his sons who didn't do a very good job, and that in the year 6 of the common time, as we have noticed on other occasions, the Roman government removed him and sent its own men there as well, procurators, as governors, whatever title you want. And of course, the most famous later on would turn out to be Pontius Pilate, who came there in the year 26 and would be in that Judea until 36. So he had a 10-year reign, and it was during that period of time, of course, that the story of Jesus and his mission came to an end in Jerusalem under his aegis. That would be Pontius Pilate. All right, so all of that, again, is a little bit of a review about the importance of the Galilee. Now, the territory had been taken by the Assyrians in the year 732, had conquered the upper area of the Palestine. And in fact, the Assyrians had called it the province of Megiddo. Megiddo today, by the way, for those who are archaeologists, have found it a very insightful place to dig up and to get the remains of. And it sits at a kind of position in the Galilee where you can see over the area of the Galilee for many, many miles. So strategically, Megiddo, or Megiddo, however you want to pronounce that, has a strategic situation. And I say strategic because it was there that was able to govern if invading forces would be coming, to kind of get the perspective of conflict if you needed forces. That's another story, and you can find some of that again in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or the First Testament, as some writers call that, and occasionally I refer to that, by the way. Those, just as an aside, who said, well, we need to be careful about calling things Old Testament and New Testament, or Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible. Some refer to this as the First Testament. That would be the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and then the Christian would be the Second Testament. So just again, a little bit of terminology that is used by those who study Scripture here. Galilee was known as the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. Now, both of those names, by the way, refer to two of the sons of Jacob. One remembers that Jacob had 12 sons, and that the territory of Israel, Palestine, had been divided among them. That goes back way to the days of Joshua and the first time in which the Israelites had come after the years of wandering in the wilderness into the promised land. The Galilee itself, in terms of territory, is a relatively small area. It's about 45 miles from north to south, and also at the time that we're looking at, they spoke of Upper Galilee and Lower Galilee. Now, how upper and lower do you go with such a small little bit of land would, I suppose, be something that map makers like, or villagers would like. So all of that indicates why perhaps Jesus now moves his, and this is what we're going to hear in the little account that we hear this time, moves to Capernaum. Why? Well, as I mentioned, because of its strategic location. Apparently it was a sizable enough city in terms of city. Now, please don't think of cities even like the size perhaps of Buffalo, and certainly not of Chicago or New York. But at least was much larger than many of the villages and the hamlets that made up the territory of the Galilee. So we also mentioned here that it was a good trade city, and therefore, from the viewpoint of if you're going to have kind of a center where you can successfully perhaps carry out a mission of teaching and healing, was a good place to go. And so you have to give Jesus credit, I suppose, in finding an apt place to begin and to carry out the ministry that he had. So we also hear now, all right, so that Jesus is taking, now keep in mind, what is Jesus' message here? Repent, for the reign of heaven has approached. Well, doesn't that sound a little bit familiar? Because it's similar to what John had said. See, and that's what goes back to the point we were making a few minutes ago of the connection that John and Jesus had with regard to essentially the message, except that from the viewpoint certainly of Matthew and also of Mark and Luke, that Jesus is that fulfillment of what expectations people might have had. So as Jesus ventures out on his own and he gathers disciples with him, now, and we hear the story of the 4 disciples that he chooses, 2 brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John. Before I move too far off of this, that Jesus is pictured here as a healer, I would suggest that Jesus here might be seen as what we would call a folk hero. He is not a healer by profession. There were some men in the time in which we're looking at, New Testament times, who were known really in a certain way as a professional, if you could say that, healers. That was their job. People went to them. People perhaps often walked away better than when they first met that person. I'm not saying that they were doctors in the sense that we might know them today, but certainly they had recognized gifts that particularly they used on a basis that maybe provided them with an income. So all of that would say they were professional healers, but Jesus is really seen perhaps more as a folk hero. He kind of hits and misses, doesn't he not? Think about that. Different people that he heals, sometimes they come to him asking to be healed. On rare occasions, Jesus even reaches out and brings his healing gifts to those in need. So again, when we think of Jesus as a folk hero, we smile a little bit, but think about that. Some of our most famous heroes are those who fall into that category. All right, so Jesus is beginning a ministry. He gathers together, as we mentioned, disciples. Now again, those disciples who we notice are fishermen. It may perhaps come a little bit, and we may have mentioned this certainly before, that they were not necessarily poor men, okay? After all, if they were fishermen, excuse me, they had the ability to gather a number of fish. What they would do would then market that fish, and Capernaum was certainly an apt place because of the trade route that it was on to sell the fish that they caught. Now, was it always fresh fish? Come on. But they perhaps had a process of smoking it, and therefore it was transportable and was therefore a product that could be taken by traders as they moved through or down the Via Maris. So what one might notice is that Peter and Andrew, James and John, the Zebedee family, had a kind of good business going on and were therefore fairly well off. if from the viewpoint of financially, we sometimes think of them as poor. Well, Jesus speaks about the importance of the poor, but I'm just kind of suggesting that maybe these 4, at least men and their family, and very often an industry such as the fishing, was something which belonged to the family. So therefore, when Jesus calls them to be his disciples, keep in mind that they would have had a certain skill in how to organize things and keep things going. So Peter and his friends had this large business and a partnership with the Zebedee family. Also, as we have mentioned before, that there was a dry season and a wet season. What we means that the dry season is when farmers simply waited for the harvest to come in. The fishing business was to others an opportunity for them to make a certain income. Now, again, just reaffirming here that Jesus therefore picks men who have a certain skill. See, I don't mean this in any unkind way, but to say that they were just kind of dumb fishermen and all they could do would be to fish. No, not at all. They perhaps were well off, and so when they leave to follow Jesus, well, they are leaving behind considerable wealth or income. Now, and I have mentioned this on other occasions, and we can't be sure of this, that did they just leave their families to follow Jesus and suddenly, well, dear, take care of things, I'm gone now? Or did they take them with them? Did the families of men like Peter? We know that Peter was married. We don't know about the others too much. We can only make some assumptions there. Or if indeed it was what we call the dry and the wet season, that there was a time for fishing, and there was a time when fishing wasn't so good, and that's why they were kind of cleaning their nets and getting ready, and maybe could afford to go with Jesus on some of his missions throughout the Galilee. That's why I've given a little bit of background about the Galilee, to kind of listen to what he was doing, to be supportive of him and by him, and may have come back again at home. We really don't know the extent of Jesus' ministry in the Galilee from the viewpoint of the synoptic writers. If we had only the synoptic writers, one would think that Jesus' ministry may have been only one season, because Matthew, Luke, and John, Mark will picture Jesus as coming down or up, however you want, to Jerusalem at Passover time. It's a little different story. We have mentioned this earlier on when we look at the gospel tradition according to John. John pictures Jesus as going to Jerusalem at least for 3 Passovers, so therefore we, from that point of view, believe that his ministry extended over a 3-year period. That would be the Johannine viewpoint. It's hard to put together just how long Jesus' ministry is from the viewpoint of the synoptics. So be that as it may, that's a little bit of the background for the episode that we hear this time. Jesus, therefore, as we've seen, moves from Nazareth to Capernaum, teaches in the synagogue. We have mentioned also on other occasions that the synagogue, we are used to interpreting that as really having a threefold understanding, namely That number one, it was a place to worship. Number two, it was a place to learn. And number three, it was a place to celebrate. Some point out that maybe in Jesus' time, the synagogue did not necessarily mean that it was a place of worship, that it was the synagogue represented, and notice that this is what the commandment says, a day of rest. So that therefore the idea of the synagogue was that people gathered to kind of learn and to listen. All right, now, so we'll have to move that one along. Christians begin to really make that an important day of worship. I'd like to just conclude here with a few ideas about the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, which is perhaps one of the more important letters of Paul in terms of developing Christian understanding. And in the little section that we hear this time, Paul is concerned to remind the Corinthians that they need to be careful about division. And he mentions that some belong to a group that are gathered around Apollos. Others are connected around Cephas. Cephas, of course, is Paul's word for Peter. Others are gathered around me, Paul. And then there are others who claim that they are gathered around Christ. Now, Paul here, in the little section that we hear, is concerned about the fact of bickering and pettiness, that this is going to, if they don't do something about this, is divisive to community. Paul's image, which he develops a little further as we go along here, of the body, says, if you have body parts hurting one another, it doesn't work too well. We do know that Apollos, who, by the way, came from the Egyptian city of Alexandria, which was a very important city of learning, had come from there, and that there is some instances that found Paul and Apollos together. So sometimes they are pictured as adversarial, but that does not seem to be the case here. We do know that Apollos was with Paul when he was at Ephesus. We don't know whether he really ever was with Paul in Corinth. We also are not sure that Peter, Cephas, ever came to Corinth, although there may have been some members of Corinth who had heard Peter or associated with Peter enough that they had some message about Jesus that was patroningly associated. All right, so that's what the little section here is. Paul says, Chloe has told me about what's going on here. We're not sure who Chloe was. We believe that she was the head of a household in Corinth, which again is interesting because sometimes we forget that most of the little church, that they were communities of believers. That when we talk about the church of Corinth, sometimes we think of a universal group with one head. Maybe not. Maybe we had smaller little believing communities in Jesus in Corinth, and that therefore when they said, well, Apollos says this, Cephas says this, that was something that was divisive. So, and that seems to be an issue that will be addressed throughout the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians. Be careful to avoid this kind of arguing with one another. It simply is not healthy for the development of believing and accepting Jesus. Thank goodness, I suppose some say that doesn't happen today, and that may be one of the reasons why Paul's letter here is so very important. Paul argues against rhetoric. Well, we have mentioned this on other occasions, and we will talk about this at other times again. As regard a good rhetorician, Paul himself, the writer of these letters, was very good at that. So although he kind of cautions others about it, he himself engages in that. So this week we listen as Jesus begins his public ministry, and hope that this message, as Matthew presents it, helps our own faith and love and trust in the Lord to increase. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.